Question: why are so many people unwilling to take responsibility for their own lives? The default setting for these people is the victim mindset. Okay, so this is obviously a very important question. Or you could say it's not important at all. It would be an important question for people who are willing to overcome the victim mindset. But unfortunately, most of the people who are in the victim mindset don't want to overcome it, and therefore they would not be willing to listen to an explanation anyway. But in order to really understand this question, you have to know Ascended Master teachings. And I explain these in more detail in my video about how the world was created. And if you watch that video, you'll have a better foundation for understanding this answer. But I will give some highlights here. So the first thing you need to recognize is that our world, the world we live in, not just the material universe or the physical plane, but also what is the totality of our world, this is an educational institution. We are meant to interact with our environment. We are meant to experiment with our creative abilities. And as we do this, we raise our awareness. We raise our awareness both of how the world works, but also who we are. We are essentially defining ourselves as we go along. And we are designed to be co-creators. And that means that there are beings, it's not ultimately the creator. There is one creator who started our world of form, but our particular level, such as planet Earth, was created by Ascended Masters at the next level up in vibration, what we could call the spiritual realm. So they created the Earth as a platform. And then we were sent into embodiment here in physical bodies to continue the creation, to build on the foundation set by the Ascended Masters. But what happened, and again I explained this in more depth in the other video, what happened was that after a long time, the Earth went into a downward spiral, where people became afraid of experimenting with their co-creative abilities. And after a long time, after this spiral had reached a certain climax, the Ascended Masters realized that it would lead to the destruction of the planet, or at least life on the planet. It would no longer be able to function as a platform for learning. And so in order to break up the mindset that had caused the downward spiral, they allowed two types of beings to embody here that came from outside the Earth. And one group was what I call the fallen beings, who are beings who have rebelled against the creative process. And another group was what I call avatars, who came from natural planets to hold a certain balance. So when you understand this, you understand that ever since the fallen beings came here, they have attempted to control humanity, primarily the original inhabitants of the Earth. And they have attempted to turn the original inhabitants into blind followers. This is what Jesus referred to actually when he talked about the blind leading the blind. Those who are sons of the devil, who are the false leaders, they look beautiful outward because they seem to have great knowledge and wisdom, but inwardly they are filled with dead men's bones, like whitened sepulchres filled with dead men's bones. And what has happened over a long period of time is that these fallen beings have created societies where there was one or a small group of leaders. And everybody else was pretty much beaten into submission to follow these leaders blindly and obey them blindly. And in many cases, this led to some disastrous results because, as I've explained, there isn't just one fallen being that can set itself up as the superior leader, because there's always going to be at least one other who's competing with the first one. So there are two that are in conflict with each other. They both want to be superior, and therefore they have to fight each other. So this has created many of the wars you see in the past, and even wars beyond known history. And so many times the general population have been pulled into supporting this fallen being as their leader, thinking that he or she was infallible because they appeared to be so wise. And then it has led to a defeat and a disastrous outcome. And the net result of this is that many people on earth have become afraid of making their own decisions. As the questioner says, they become afraid of taking responsibility for their lives because they believe they can't make good decisions. They can't know what's right and wrong or what is the best thing to do. So that's why they have come to feel in this victim consciousness where they don't have the ability, the knowledge to run their own lives, and they feel like they need somebody to tell them what to do. But on the other hand, they also feel that they are a victim of this, whoever their leader is. They can't object to it. They can't object to what the leader is doing or saying. And this, of course, does not mean that all people on earth are like this. Because if all people were like this, the earth would be in a downward spiral and things would be getting worse and worse. I know there are some people who will say, but it is getting worse and worse. But is it really? You look at the democratic world, you look at the fact that we have democracy, because as I said, these fallen beings, they want to control people. And the best way to control people is to have a dictatorship, where there's one leader, supreme leader at the top, and everybody else has to do what he says, or they get killed. So the fact that we have democracy shows you that these fallen beings are starting to lose control over the planet. And why are they doing this? Because more and more people have basically seen the limitations of these leaders. It hasn't been widely known, but if you look at it, you look at history, there's a small power elite of beings who have controlled most societies we see in history. And you look at the great example of this is the Roman emperors, who had all power. They were almost like a god on earth. But look how crazy they were. They were completely insane, and they created all of this nonsense and eventually led to the fall of the Roman Empire. So many people have started to wake up and realize this just isn't right. And the only way for them to change their lives and get out of this obeying this almighty leader is to take responsibility for themselves and make their own decisions. And that's why democracy came into being. And that's why we have a large part of the population on earth who live in democratic countries, because they have been willing to take some responsibility, not the full responsibility, but at least some. So we can see that there is a clear trend that we are moving up in terms of people being willing to take responsibility for their lives and expand their awareness and understanding, which of course is the whole purpose of life to begin with. So we have an upward movement. We also, of course, see, especially in these years, that there are still these forces led by the fallen beings who are trying to stop this evolution. In reality, they can't. Otherwise, they would have stopped it in 1776, when the founding fathers of America rebelled against the King of England, who was clearly a representative of these fallen leaders. So they are on the losing end, but they are trying to create as much chaos as they can, so they can, so to speak, go out with a bang. And you look at some countries on earth, and I'm not saying you don't find people in democratic countries who are somewhat in the victim consciousness, but you mainly find it in these dictatorships. A typical example is Russia. I mean, do you really think that communism could have taken over in any country in the world? No. It required people who weren't willing to take responsibility for themselves, so they would submit to this state, this almighty state. You see the same thing in China. Why could Mao come to power and get the Chinese people to submit to him as the almighty leader? Yeah, I know he was willing to kill anybody who objected him, but why were they willing to let this happen? It was because there are these groups of people on earth who are not willing to take responsibility. Why are there people in Arab countries who are accepting the Sharia law and the suppression of women? Well, because they are not willing to take responsibility for themselves. They want somebody else to tell them how to live. It's commonly said that in Russia, for example, the Russian people have a social contract with Putin, that Putin can do whatever he wants as long as he stays out of their daily lives. So they can live whatever life they are living. And he doesn't interfere with that. Then he can do whatever he wants in terms of creating a war or whatever. But don't mess with their daily lives. That's the social contract. But that, of course, as you can see, is starting to break down now, because Putin has, by going to war in Ukraine, interfered with people's lives in a variety of ways. One is sending them to war, but also prices going up and this and that. So what I'm saying is that we're actually living in a time that is sort of a transition phase. Many spiritual people talk about from Pisces to Aquarius, but we are also transitioning into what the Ascended Master Saint Germain calls a golden age. And in order to do this within a reasonable time frame, it's like the people who are resisting growth, they have to act out in more and more extreme ways. And part of the purpose of this is, of course, that there can come a point, hopefully, where the critical mass of Russian people have had enough and say, why should we have this kind of society? The same thing with the Chinese, the same thing with the Arabs. Why do we accept this society with the Sharia law and the suppression of women and all of this? And you see how this is starting to rise. It's like the questioning of this leadership model with the almighty, all-knowing dictator is really gaining momentum around the world. At least, that's how I look at it. I know you could probably argue against it, but that's how I see it. And so, I guess what I'm saying is that, as I see it, in the coming years, the dictatorships will fall, gradually fall. And you just saw here a couple of weeks before I'm making this video, Assad in Syria. His regime, his father and his regime had been there for 50 years. And they have been brutally suppressing the Syrian people. And all of a sudden, within a couple of weeks, it just all falls apart. And I think this is what is going to happen with these dictatorships around the world. But before some of them fall, they have to become more extreme. And you see Putin, how he's forced to become more and more extreme in order to defend his position. You see Xi in China also becoming more and more extreme, more and more dictatorial. He's taken on the same powers as Mao had, even though the Chinese leaders had actually vowed they would never allow that to happen again. They would never allow one person to get the same power that Mao had, because they saw the abuse of power. So you see how this becomes more and more extreme. And what you really see is that these dictators, they can't stop themselves. It's like they are so blinded. They have blinders on, and they can only see things a certain way. And when they feel threatened, when they feel their power is threatened, they can only apply more force, more brutality, more aggression against their own people. And there simply comes a point where the people don't want to take it anymore. And then they start taking responsibility. They start saying, well, we can't allow Putin to do whatever he wants. I have been watching a channel, I don't know if you are aware of it, but there's a channel called Inside Russia, YouTube channel, by a Russian who left Russia when the war started. And he's now talking about developments in Russia. And he seems to really understand it quite well and know so much about Russia, because obviously he's a Russian. And he had an episode where he lives abroad, and there was a vacation in Russia, and there were many Russians that came there. And he tried to talk to them about things in Russia and about the war. And he said most of these people didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to have opinions. They didn't even want to have an opinion about it. It was not something they were willing to talk about. They weren't even willing to think about it. But what I'm saying is, as things become more and more extreme, people will be forced out of that victim mindset. and they'll be forced to think, and they'll be forced to decide, what kind of a country do I want to live in? And so this is what the Ascended Master called the School of Hard Knocks. And once people are in the School of Hard Knocks, it's only a question of how hard do the knocks have to become before they can't take it anymore. And now they decide to take some responsibility for themselves. I know a lot more could be said about this, and I have actually talked about it in several videos, but I think this is enough for now. This is a difficult planet to be in the victim mindset, because it just becomes worse and worse, more and more extreme, until you decide, I am not a victim. I can actually take responsibility for my life. I can actually know and understand what's going on. I can actually decide which kind of a society do I want to live in. And as I said in the beginning, people in the victim consciousness probably wouldn't even be willing to listen to this. But it doesn't matter so much because, as I said, many people in the democratic world have started to move out of the victim consciousness. And we who are in this mindset, we can pull up on the collective. So what you actually see in the world is, I talked about the School of Hard Knocks, but and in the School of Hard Knocks, people only learn by the knocks becoming harder. But on the other hand, what is it that makes them turn around? When they come to a point where they say, I can't take this anymore, now I'm going to take responsibility and decide what kind of country I live in. It's actually because the collective consciousness has been raised. And what the people in the democratic world, people who are taking responsibility for themselves, what they are doing, they are pulling up on a collective, which means that it actually becomes easier for people in the victim consciousness to take responsibility. But of course, you can't force their free will. So that's why there is this interchange. The democratic world is pulling up on a collective consciousness. Many people are pulling up on a collective consciousness. And there are, of course, people in Russia and other dictatorial nations who are also taking responsibility for themselves and pulling up. So there is that force of pulling up on the collective to make it easier for people to change and take responsibility. But at the same time, those who are not willing to do it, the hard knocks become harder and harder and harder because the dictators act out in more and more extreme ways. So I know that from a certain perspective it looks like things are getting worse, but it's really that things are becoming more extreme in order to speed up the growth. And therefore, my vision is that within the next 10 years, we will see some rather dramatic changes in the world. And suddenly we will get over this hump where we think, many people think things are getting worse. We actually see that the extremes led to an awakening among the general population that will bring the world forward. So you can remember this video and look back in 10 years and see if I was right or not. I hope I'm around to see it in 10 years.